A set of Supermoto wheels makes a bike like this a pure fun machine. I highly recommend everybody do it. So I figured we get into the specifics of putting a set together. The sizes, the tires, the clearancing, everything involved in going the way of the Sumo. And it's a perfect time to do so because I've had my set on for a few years now and it's in need of a refresh. So let me take these off real quick and we can get a closer look at the core of what makes a Supermoto, wheels and tires. The fronts are 17 inches in diameter and 3.5 inches wide. Compare that to the stock rim at 21 inches in diameter. This one is gonna sit a lot lower. A very common size, but not the only option. If you wanna be even Supermoto-ier, that's a word now, you could opt to get a slightly smaller 16.5 inch diameter rim. The 16.5 option is really only there if you're planning on legit racing your bike or if you just simply love throwing money away just so you can say you have a real Supermoto. 16.5 inch tires are not only hard to find at the usual retailers, but when you do, they're gonna be at least 2 or 3 times the price. Seriously, just stick with the 17s like I did. It's a very common sport bike size and you're going to find plenty of tires available at reasonable prices. Speaking of tires, the front here is specifically a 120-70 R17. What that means is it's 120 millimeters wide, the sidewall is 70% of that, and the diameter 17 inches. The rear, also 17 inches in diameter, but 4.25 inches wide. Unlike the fronts, this doesn't get any smaller, but you can go wider. You can get a 17 by 5 inch rim. And the wider rim size does actually fit. I have seen people run 17 by 5s in the rear. The reason why you do that, of course, is so that you can run a wider tire, but it's a pretty tight fit in there already, and I don't really see the benefit of getting a few extra millimeters in tire width. It's not worth the headache of getting it to actually fit in there and clear everything. With the 4.25s, this is running a 150-60 R17. With the wider rim, of course, you could go with something like a 160, but again, I think that's too much of a headache for what it's worth. Besides, with these 150s, it's not like I'm exactly chicken strip free. So I said I was giving this setup a refresh, and the tires are the primary reason why. I've had these on for almost 3 years and over 4,000 miles, and this is the state that they're in. Unlike cars, motorcycles don't really have a set number of miles that they're good for, because ultimately it just depends. It depends on how you ride, where you ride, and on what bike. But there are a few things that you can look for to see whether or not your tires are past their prime. Besides the obvious ones, of course. If there's a nail stuck in it, or if there's cords showing, or if it's in more than one piece, you should change it. Duh. First thing to look for are the wear markers towards the center of the tire. If your wear markers are flush, they're done. The other test, if you can't find the wear markers, is the old penny trick. You stick Abe upside down, and if you can see the top of his head, then you know the tread is too worn. Another thing to look at is the roundness of the tire itself. It's common to see with the rear, like this one, flatten itself and kind of square off over time. It just shows how much of that you took off of the tire's curve when it was brand new. Finally, check the tread for signs of cracking or splitting. This does happen over time. The tire dries out, so even a tire with perfect tread could still be bad if it's 5 years old or more. Tires will have a date code with the week and the year that they were produced. So those are the reasons why I need new tires. And if you look at the fronts, you can see similar signs, but it's not as obvious. Yes, this does have tread left. It's not down to the wear lines, but that makes sense for a front wheel because the front wheel doesn't have as much weight on it. It's not the driven wheel. There's not force on it. So it's going to have more tread generally. But if you look a little bit closer, you'll see that there is some signs of cracking and there's even some small cuts in the treads. We're just going to replace them both at the same time. The tires that I've been running, by the way, are Dunlop Sportmax GPR 300s. They're a basic lightweight sport bike tire and they've held up pretty well. I actually don't have any complaints. But there are plenty of other options out there for Supermotos. You could also get the Dunlop Q5s, you can get Pirelli Diablo Rossos, and you can get Michelin Pilot Power 2CTs, among others. And I definitely would have gone with the GPRs again, but they weren't in stock at the time, so I went with another popular option, Bridgestone Battle Axe. And I've never actually ridden these ones before. I've had Dunlop Q3s in the past, I've had Michelins, I've had Shinkos in the past, but never Bridgestone, so I'm actually curious to see how these things hold up. And while I have these off of the bike, it's the perfect time to get them cleaned up because cleaning spoked rims is literally the worst. The chain's in the way, the brake's in the way, everything's covered in dust, and on top of that, if you have spoke wraps like I do, they get sun faded, they get pinched, they get greasy, it's disgusting. I'm even gonna take off the rear sprocket so that I have even more room to work with and that I'm not constantly tearing up my fingers by hitting it. Speaking of the rear sprocket, let's talk gearing real quick. For a Supermoto setup, you don't need as big of a gear in the rear. The stock setup is much shorter gearing and it's intended for that because it's a dual sport, so it needs to do things like navigate at small speeds, go up steep hills, things like that. Street riding, on the other hand, prioritizes more speed and less of a need to shift through all the gears as frequently. Stock gearing in the rear is 51 teeth and I've personally gone with 48 teeth. I feel like this is a happy middle, so it gives me a little bit longer of gear and I'm not shifting as much, but still gives me that acceleration. Although you could go lower, you could go with something like 46, even 44 teeth. Another option, and you can do this in addition, is to, rather than going shorter in the back, you can go higher in the front. So instead, you'd be swapping out your front sprocket from a 13 up to a 14. But we'll get back to the wheel cleanup, and it will take some time, so I'm thinking we need a montage.
Yup, time once again for a video montage song. Yup, it's time once again for a video montage. It's my call to say when, even though it feels like a barrage. Still moving this along, pacing it again with a song. I think the music gives it class, but rapping spoke sucks ass. But rapping spoke sucks ass. It's another montage song made with AI, still not creative, but at least I try. Cut me some slack. Na 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 na.
Much better. So as you can see, we got everything cleaned up. We ripped out those old spokes and put new ones in. Now, I'm sure you were probably hoping that I would have gone with no spoke wraps at all, or at least a solid color, something other than what I've been running, but I'm man enough to admit that I love a good rainbow, so rainbow it is. But I understand that may be a little bit much for some of you, so don't worry. I made the other side of the wheels a solid color this time. Hot pink. Now, as these are prepped and ready, let's talk fitment, because you can't just take out the stock wheels and slap some Supermotos in there and be on your merry way. Trimming is required. And I can show you that fitment before we actually go throwing these tires in here, so you can see a lot clearer the things that I had to do previously. In the front, here is the fork guards. These are the two main things that you need to deal with, and they need to be cut because otherwise the wheel, being as wide as it is going to rub against these. I did a 90-degree cut right here and a 90-degree cut right down. This went all the way across right here. I cut a little bit more than is necessary, but it made the job a lot easier. And then for some added clearance after the fact, when I put this on with the wheel and everything, I just needed a little bit more, this little dimple right here. Same on the other side, I just used one as a template for the other and made the mirror image. And then when we get into the rear here, there is no plastic trim that you need to worry about, except unless you make some changes to the chain drive. If you replace your chain with something aftermarket, you have to be aware of a couple of things. Number one, that not all 520 chains are created equal. If you have a normal 520 chain that's pretty thick, it will actually rub on the backside all the way around here, and that wears away, and when that wears away, it cracks. You don't want that. So make sure that first of all, you get the proper chain. I'll put them up on the screen, the ones that you should get. In addition to that, like I mentioned, behind this is a little shim that Warp 9 provided me to bring it out just ever so slightly, so that helps. Only about 1 millimeter, but every millimeter counts. And in this case, swapping from a 13 to a 14, it gives a wider diameter, and that wider diameter also pushes it further away from the engine case, because the engine case kind of rolls in and tapers towards the center. So even more clearance from here, so that's good. The other thing you may need to worry about when it comes to aftermarket chains is the lower chain guide here. So the chain actually will go through this, right through the center. It slides out here and then splits into two pieces. And at least in my case, the chain was wide enough that it was actually rubbing on this. So you can see on this side in particular, I think this is the inside towards the tire, it was wearing this thing out and actually catching on the master link. What I did was just trim some of this off with a razor blade. It's not the cleanest in the world, but it does clear now, so now I don't have any kind of rubbing whatsoever. Just keep an ear out whenever you make any changes, not just to the Supermoto setup itself, but if you're gonna add anything like a chain as well. All right, enough talk. Let's actually just put the wheels on, install them, and get this thing rolling once again. I did have to wait for quite a while because one of the things that I didn't think I needed to do, but turns out I did, was replace that rear sprocket. The aluminum one from Warp 9 was getting a little cut up. You could see the divots in there, so got that replaced, as well as a new chain, because if you're gonna do the sprockets, you might as well do the chain. But we're gonna do the front one here first, because the front one is a little bit easier, and that way I can ease myself into it just a little bit, because that rear, that takes some effort. Now we got the front wheel on, but there's a couple of things I actually forgot to talk about when it comes to fitment and clearancing. So not only are we cutting plastic here with the fork guards, but we have to reroute the brake lines. As you can see, the brake lines for mine are on the outside here. Traditionally, they are on the inside with a stock rim. Also, another thing regarding the brakes that I actually just discovered recently, I really want to share this with you. So one of the things that you have to do, because you have a larger brake rotor, is of course get a different bracket, basically to move the caliper further away so that it's actually touching in the right spot. So when you buy a Supermoto kit, or at least hopefully when you do, it will come with a relocation bracket like this. That's this one compared to the stock one here, and if you've done this setup swap before, then you know one of the things you have to do is move this pin, in this case from the stock, to the extension, or vice versa if you're going back to the dual sport. It isn't that big of a deal. Yes, it is one little bolt, but it can be annoying. Unfortunately, if you look at the schematics for this bike, you can only buy the caliper with the bolt, which is really annoying because I'm not overpaying that much for a bolt. But thankfully, Yamaha to the rescue. You can actually get just this bolt from Yamaha. Take note, this is the part number that you want to get for this. This is for some 2015 250F. If you look up that part number, you will get just this bolt. So that way you can put this on your stock caliper or on your new aftermarket extension caliper bracket, and that way you don't have to go swapping between the two. They will both just have the pins and you can just pull one out and push one in. It makes it so much easier, and it's only $3 too, so I highly recommend you get it. Another thing when installing the front bracket here to note is that because the rotor is so big and the diameter of the rim is so small, there is a really tiny gap right here. So much so that you can't just put this in with it fully assembled. So when you're putting it together before you get it on the bike itself, only put in one brake pad. Don't put the interior one in because you will need that space in order to slide this thing in without getting in the way of the rim. So once you have that slid in, and then you have the bolts started on this side, then you'll have to fish in the other side of the brake pad. And don't forget to do that, obviously. You want to make sure that you're running both brake pads. All right, now for the fun part, the rear wheel. There is a lot of finagling with this because it's such a wide tire that you have to kind of bring the brake caliper onto the wheel as you're putting it in. You can't just slide it in like you do with the dual sport setup. And not only that, but there's a little bit of gymnastics involved because you got to make sure that that's all lined up and hovering in the relatively the right position so that you can slide the axle through everything, making sure that you catch it all and get it all the way through while it's being held up. So make sure you stretch before this. Oh, for fuck's sake. Spacer fell out. I can get it in there, but now I have to like find the place to push it in. It's not happening. There we go. Oh, yes. That right there, that's a beautiful sight. Well, we've gone over the hurdle. The hard part is behind us. Now the easy part, just putting the drivetrain back together. So we got to put the lower chain guard back on. We got to put the top chain guard back on and put the chain together. Speaking of chain, when I got a new one, it's a stock length chain, but it's assuming that you had the 51 tooth in the back. Now I have a 48 tooth. So in order to make this one fit, I just had to take 2 links off of that. Then we're able to finish everything up. Well, nothing left to do now but actually take this thing for a ride and scrub the tires in and ensure that the spoke wraps are never going to be as clean as they currently are. Until the next refresh, that is.